Have you ever heard just one sentence that changed everything you thought you knew about your life? For Walter Harris, a 79-year-old retired carpenter from Nashville, Tennessee, that moment came on a warm summer night. Wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't searching for drama, but he overheard something that broke him in ways he never thought possible. As Walter sat quietly in the living room, his son David Harris spoke in the next room, not in anger, not in rage, but in a low voice meant only for himself. The words were simple, almost casual. "My dad disgusts me." Just 6 words. No yelling, no argument, no chance to defend himself. But for Walter, those words landed heavier than a lifetime of hard labor. This was the same man who had sacrificed everything, running his small carpentry shop 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, just to keep food on the table. This was the man who had taken on both roles, father and mother, after losing his beloved wife years ago. Walter had raised his children with his own hands, driving them to Little League, paying for braces, and even covering David's college tuition. And yet, in that single, careless moment, his son's whisper cut deeper than any wound. Walter Harris knew, right then and there, that his world had changed forever. Walter Harris had never thought of himself as a great man. He didn't chase riches, and he never cared for recognition. What he cared about was family. After his wife, Margaret, passed away far too young, Walter made a quiet promise to himself, his children. David and Emily would never feel the weight of that loss. As long as he was alive, he poured his life into keeping that promise. 6 days a week, Walter opened a small carpentry shop before sunrise, his hands rough and calloused from decades of labor. He built kitchen tables for neighbors, repaired cabinets for local churches, and handcrafted rocking chairs that still sat on porches across the county. Every dollar earned went toward his children's needs. When Emily needed braces, he took on weekend jobs. When David dreamed of playing baseball, Walter drove hours to tournaments, eating peanut butter sandwiches in the cab of his old pickup because there wasn't money left for diners. And when it came time for college, Walter didn't hesitate to sign the loan papers. He told himself the debt didn't matter. What mattered was giving his son the future he himself had never known. Through it all, Walter never complained. Neighbors admired his dedication, often saying that man lives for his kids. And in truth, he did. The house he built, 3 bedrooms on 2 acres, was more than a structure. It was a symbol of every sacrifice, every late night, every drop of sweat that he had given to hold his family together. But sacrifice has a weight, even when carried in silence. At times, Walter longed for companionship. He missed Margaret's gentle laugh, the way she used to hum while folding laundry. Yet he buried that ache, telling himself there wasn't time for longing. His children came first, always. That's why David's whisper cut so deeply. "My dad disgusts me." Those 6 words weren't just cruel. They were a dismissal of everything Walter had built his life around. It was as if decades of devotion, nights spent worrying over bills, and years of lonely effort had been swept aside like sawdust on a workshop floor. Walter tried to shake it off. Maybe David had spoken out of frustration, he told himself, and maybe he didn't mean it. But the truth is, words have a way of lodging themselves in the heart. And once they're there, they echo. They grow louder in the silence of the night until they can't be ignored for Walter. That echo turned into a question he had never dared ask. What has all this sacrifice really given me? He looked around at the house, at the framed photos on the mantel, at the tools hanging neatly in the garage. At the empty chair where Margaret once had tanned for the first time, he didn't feel pride, felt hollow. It wasn't just about being disrespected. It was about realizing that his love had become invisible. The bedtime stories, the Little League drives, the home-cooked dinners, all of it had faded from memory in the very person he had given it to. David didn't see his father as a man who had given everything, saw him as a burden. That realization was the crack that split Walter's world in two. Up until that night, he had always believed his sacrifices would be enough, that one day his children would look back and see the quiet heroism of a father who never gave up. But sitting there in the stillness, replaying David's words, Walter understood something painful. Love, when it isn't valued, can become a chain that holds you down. And in that moment, a thought crept in, one he had never considered before. Maybe it's time to stop carrying this weight. Maybe it's time to live for me. That night, sleep never came to Walter Harris. He lay on his back in the dark, the steady hum of the ceiling fan doing nothing to quiet his mind. His body was exhausted from years of hard labor, but his thoughts spun restlessly, circling the same wound over and over again. He closed his eyes, but the words refused to fade. My dad disgusts me. It wasn't just a sentence anymore. It had become a weight pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He shifted on the mattress, pulling the thin sheet tighter. But no comfort came. Walter began replaying the years in his mind. He thought of the mornings he rose before dawn, packing school lunches while coffee percolated on the counter. He remembered rushing from the shop to catch Emily's choir recitals, showing up in his work boots because he didn't have time to change. He thought of David's graduation, the way his heart had swelled with pride when his son walked across the stage, diploma in hand. He had clapped louder than anyone, tears stinging his eyes, convinced it had all been worth it. But lying there now, Walter wondered, had David ever seen those moments the way he had? Had they meant anything to him at all? The silence of the house made the questions louder. The walls seemed to echo with ghost Margaret's laughter in the kitchen. It's the thud of children's feet running down the hallway, the smell of Sunday dinners that used to fill every corner. That house had been alive once. It felt like a mausoleum of memories, each one reminding him of how far things had fallen. Walter turned onto the outline of Margaret's rocking chair in the corner. After she passed, he had never moved it. At first, it had been a comfort something of hers, still close. But tonight it looked different. It looked like an accusation. It gave everything, Walter. And still, it wasn't enough. The hours dragged. Midnight came and went. At 2 a.m, he rose, shuffled into the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. He stood there in the dim light, staring at the family photographs pinned to the refrigerator with old magnets. David's college picture smiled back at him, unknowing, innocent. Emily's wedding photo showed her radiant, holding her father's arm with pride. Walter touched the edge of the frame and felt a sting of betrayal, not from them, but from life itself. It wasn't anger he felt. Not really. It was something deeper, a hollowing out. A realization that despite all he had poured into being a father, he had somehow ended up empty. He carried the water back to his room but didn't drink it. Instead, he sat at the edge of the bed, his back bent, his hands clasped together, staring down at the worn carpet. For the first time in 79 years, he asked himself a question he never thought he'd ask. What if I stopped? What if I just let go? It startled him, the honesty of it. Walter had built his entire identity around providing, around sacrificing. To even consider stepping away felt like betrayal. But as the thought settled in, it didn't sting the way he expected. It felt almost like relief. By 4 a.m, his eyes burned with exhaustion, but his mind had found a strange clarity. He realized he couldn't keep carrying a weight that no one else cared about. His children had built their lives, for better or worse. Maybe it was time he built his own, not out of duty, but out of dignity. When the first pale light of dawn touched the curtains, Walter finally lay back down. He didn't close his eyes this time. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the birds begin their morning chorus. Somewhere inside, a decision was forming. He didn't know all the details yet, but he knew one thing. Last night had changed everything. By the time the sun rose that morning, Walter Harris was already sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The first light of day streamed across the linoleum floor, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see comfort in the house around him. He saw walls that had trapped him, rooms that whispered of everything he had lost. That house had once been his greatest pride, built with his own 2 hands, board by board, nail by nail. It had carried the spirit of his dreams. He remembered hauling lumber in his pickup truck, measuring and remeasuring until every frame stood straight. Margaret used to bring him iced tea in a mason jar as he worked through the Tennessee heat. When it was finished, the 3-bedroom ranch stood tall on its 2 acres of land, a monument to perseverance. But now, The laughter that had once filled its walls had been replaced with silence. The kitchen where Margaret's roast chicken had once perfumed the air smelled only of dust. The hallway, where David and Emily used to chase each other in their socks, now echoed only with Walter's slow footsteps. Even the front porch swing once. The setting for countless summer nights hung crooked, groaning in the wind. Walter had always believed a house could hold a family together. That morning, he realized something painful. This house wasn't holding him anymore. It was holding him back. He stood up and walked room to room, almost like a stranger touring someone else's home. In the living room, he touched the mantel where family photos still stood. Graduations, Christmas mornings, birthdays with lopsided cakes. He lingered on David's college portrait. In that picture, his son looked hopeful, proud. How had that young man turned into someone who could whisper such venom? In the bedroom, Walter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Margaret's rocking chair in the corner. For years it had been a sacred reminder of her presence, but now it felt like a heavy weight, tethering him to grief that never eased. He realized he had been living in a museum of memories, not a home. The more he walked, the heavier the walls seemed to press in. Each room told a story, but instead of comfort, those stories suffocated him. The sacrifices, the long hours, the love poured into every corner, they had all been swallowed by a son who could dismiss him in 6 careless words. By mid-morning, Walter reached a decision that both startled and steadied him. It would sell. Every beam, every nail, every patch of grass, it was time to let it go. Not because he didn't love what it had been, because he couldn't carry what it had become. He picked up the phone and called a realtor he vaguely remembered meeting. At church years ago, her name was Susan. His voice was calm as he spoke. "I'd like to put my house on the market." There was a pause on the other end, as if she had expected small talk first. But Walter wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. When he hung up, a strange calm settled over him. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was clarity. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a choice for himself, not for anyone else. As the day wore on, Walter sat on the porch, watching the breeze ripple through the tall grass of the backyard. He thought of all the cookouts, all the fireflies caught in mason jars, all the 4th of July sparklers waved in that yard. The memories would stay with him, he realized, even if the house did not. That night, the first time in weeks, Walter slept without tossing. The house creaked around him, but instead of hearing ghosts, he heard something new, the sound of a door slowly closing behind him, and another one, not yet seen, waiting to open. Walter Harris woke before dawn the next morning, long before the alarm clock had the chance to ring. The house was still, the air heavy with the kind of silence that makes a man feel the weight of his own heartbeat. But something was different. The decision had already been made, and that alone lightened the load he had carried for so long. He brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen. Yet as he stood there with his mug in hand, he felt like a visitor in his own home. The counters he had once sanded smooth, the cabinets he had hung straight with pride, none of it belonged to him anymore. Not really. They were remnants of a life he was ready to leave behind. By mid-morning, Suzanne, the realtor, arrived. She was younger than Walter remembered, dressed in a crisp blazer, carrying a tablet under her arm. She walked through each room with a polite smile, pointing out features and making notes. Walter followed quietly, his hands folded behind his back. It felt surreal, like watching someone appraise the chapters of his life. When they reached the master bedroom, Susan paused. "This house has a lot of heart," she said softly, almost as if she sensed the memories embedded in the walls. Walter gave a small nod, but said nothing. Words would have been too heavy in that moment. After she left, Walter sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him. For years, that seat had been Margaret's. He could almost see her there, still, her gentle eyes, way of listening without interrupting, her ability to calm him with nothing more than a touch. He whispered under his breath, "I think it's time, Margaret." The first for sale sign went up the following week. Neighbors stopped by, surprised, curious. One of them, Mr. Caldwell, from across the road, leaned on the fence and asked, "Walt, you sure about this? This house has Been your pride for decades. Walter gave a half smile. Sometimes holding on weighs more than letting go. It was all he offered, and Mr. Caldwell, sensing the finality in his tone, didn't press further. As days turned into weeks, something unexpected began to happen. The heaviness inside Walter slowly started to lift. He found himself whistling, while watering the plants, a habit he hadn't had in years. The creaks in the floorboards no longer sounded like accusations, but like farewells. One evening, as the sun set over the fields behind the house, Walter sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea. He thought about all the 4th of Julys spent in that yard, the sparklers, the laughter, the smell of grilled hot dogs. Those memories no longer trapped him, they comforted him. He realized he could carry them wherever he went. Yet beneath that calm, there was still a tremor of fear. Where would he go next? What would life look like in a small apartment in town? Would he feel like a stranger in his own new life? At 79, starting over wasn't just daunting, it felt almost impossible. But then, as he rocked slowly on the porch swing, Walter understood something simple yet profound. The real prison hadn't been the house, nor the past it had been the belief that he had to stay. For the first time in years, he saw a door opening. And even if he didn't know what was on the other side, he knew he had the courage to step through it. That night, Walter slept more soundly than he had in weeks. The walls around him were still the same, but in his heart, the shift had already happened. He was no longer clinging to what was. He was reaching for what could be. The day Walter Harris handed over the keys, the weight of the house seemed to fall from his shoulders. He drove away in his old Ford pickup with nothing but a few boxes stacked in the back, the essentials he couldn't bear to part with. As the ranch faded in the rearview mirror, Walter felt an ache in his chest, grief for what he was leaving behind, but also relief, like breathing clean air after being trapped in a dusty room too long. His new place was nothing grand, just a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery on the edge of downtown. The building was old, with creaky stairs and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of fresh bread every morning. When Walter first unlocked the door, he stood for a long moment in the entryway, taking in the bare white walls, the plain carpet, and the absence of history. It was strange, but it was also freeing. This place held no ghosts. The first nights were the hardest. The silence pressed against him differently now. In the house, silence had been a reminder of all that was lost. Here, it was emptiness waiting to be filled. Walter found himself lying awake, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog in the alley. It wasn't the quiet countryside he had known for decades, but in time it grew familiar. Slowly he began to carve out new routines. Each morning he brewed a pot of coffee and carried it to the small balcony outside his apartment. From there, he watched the town wake up, delivery trucks rumbling by, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, children in backpacks hurrying off to school. It was a different kind of life, smaller maybe, but it gave him something he hadn't expected. Perspective. Walter bought a few potted plants and lined them along the railing. Tending to them each day became a quiet joy, a reminder that growth was still possible, even in new soil. He picked up old habits he had long forgotten, reading books he had left gathering dust in the attic, taking slow evening walks around the neighborhood. The bakery downstairs often slipped him dulled bread for free, and he started to enjoy the simple pleasure of fresh toast with butter while sitting by the window, but with the calm came moments of doubt. One afternoon, Walter caught himself staring at a photograph of David as a boy, tucked into the corner of his wallet. The little boy who once held his hand so tightly had grown into a man who dismissed him with cruelty. For a fleeting moment, Walter wondered if leaving the house had been too drastic. If he had made a mistake by walking away. It was during one of those uncertain evenings that the phone rang. It was his daughter, Emily. Her voice, warm and steady, spilled through the receiver like a bomb. "Dad, how are you settling in?" she asked. Walter hesitated, then answered honestly. "It's quiet, Em. Different. But maybe that's what I needed." Emily chuckled softly. "You've earned a little quiet, Dad. You've carried the rest of us long enough. Those words sank deep. For years, Walter had defined himself by what he could provide, what he could build for others. Now he was learning, sometimes haltingly. Life wasn't just about sacrifice. It could also be about choosing peace. And so, Walter leaned into this new chapter. He didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but he knew he had stepped away from the weight of the past. The modest apartment, the balcony garden, the smell of fresh bread drifting up through the floorboards, it was a humble life. But it was his. And for the first time in decades, Walter Harris was beginning to live, not for obligation, not for duty, but for himself. Walter Harris was adjusting to his new life, but there were still moments when the quiet felt heavier than he could bear. The walls of his small apartment carried no history, but sometimes they echoed with doubts. In those moments, it was his daughter, Emily, who became his anchor. Emily had always been different from her brother, David. Where David had grown distant and cold, Emily carried warmth wherever she went. She was a schoolteacher in her 40s, balancing lesson plans and her own children, yet she always found time to call her father. Sometimes it was just a quick check-in. Dad, did you eat today? Other times it was a long conversation about nothing and everything. For Walter, those calls were lifelines. One Sunday afternoon, Emily stopped by with a bag of groceries. She bustled around the kitchen, putting items away as if she had always belonged there. Walter watched her, his chest tightening with quiet gratitude. "You don't have to do all this, Em," he said, though his voice carried more tenderness than protest. She turned and smiled. "I know, Dad, but I want to." When they finally sat down at the small kitchen table, Emily reached across and took his hand. "Dad," she began gently, "I've been talking to David." Walter stiffened. The sound of his son's name alone was enough to stir the ache in his chest. He braced himself. Emily's eyes were steady, her voice careful. "He knows he hurt you. He's been struggling with it. He told me he wants to apologize." Walter's breath caught, but not with hope. It was something else, weariness. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the floor. "An apology won't erase what he said, Emily. It won't erase how it made me feel." "I know," she replied softly. "I'm not asking you to forgive him right now. I just thought you should know." Walter looked at his daughter, really looked at her. The lines of responsibility etched on her face, the compassion in her eyes. Struck him how much she carried, not just for her own family but for him as well. And for the first time, he felt the urge to unburden himself. He told her about the sleepless nights, about the way those 6 words had haunted him. "My dad disgusts me." He confessed how the house had turned into a prison of memories, how selling it was the only way he could breathe again. Emily listened without interrupting, her hand never leaving his. When he finished, she gave his hand a squeeze. "Dad, I've always seen what you've done for us. You gave us everything you had, even when it cost you. Don't ever think it was for nothing." Those words cracked something open inside Walter. He hadn't realized how desperately he needed to hear them, not from David, not from anyone else, but from someone who truly understood. For the first time in a long while, Walter felt a flicker of relief. He wasn't invisible. At least to Emily, his sacrifices had mattered. Later that evening, after Emily left, Walter stood on his balcony, the city lights flickering in the distance. He thought about her words, about her quiet strength. Maybe David would one day come around, maybe he wouldn't. But in that moment, Walter realized he wasn't as alone as he thought. Emily's presence reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. That love could still be tender, still be real. And perhaps that was enough to keep moving forward. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Emily showed up at Walter Harris's apartment. She carried no groceries this time, no bright smile. Instead, she held a small envelope, the paper worn, soft at the edges, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. Walter noticed the tension in her face the moment she stepped inside. "Emily, what's wrong?" She set the envelope gently on the table. "It's from David," she said quietly. "He asked me to give it to you." The name alone made Walter's stomach tighten. For a moment he just stared at the envelope, as if it were something dangerous. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what was inside, but curiosity, and perhaps a lingering ache in his heart, got the better of him. With deliberate slowness, he slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Handwriting was unmistakable, messy, uneven, just like David's notes from high school. Walter read silently, "Dad, I don't know how to start this. I've had a lot of time to think about what I said, and I know I can't take it back. I was wrong. I was selfish. I didn't see all that you did for me, and I regret that more than I can explain. You never deserved the way I treated you. I'm sorry. I love you, Dad. I always have, even if I didn't show it." Walter let the paper fall into his lap. His chest rose and fell slowly as he leaned back in his chair. He expected anger, or maybe relief. But instead, what he felt was something stranger. Nothing. For months, he had imagined this moment. He thought David's apology would heal the wound, would somehow undo the sting of those 6 words that had broken him. Yet now, holding the letter in his hands, Walter realized the wound had already healed not by David's words, but by his own decision to let go. Emily sat across from him, her eyes searching his face. "Dad, what do you think?" Walter folded the letter neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and set it aside. "It's good he's thinking about it," he said softly. "But, I don't need this to move on. I've already found my peace." There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. Emily nodded slowly. She understood. This wasn't about rejecting her brother's apology. It was about Walter, choosing not to let his worth depend on it anymore. Later, that evening, after Emily left, Walter stepped out onto his balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets below slick and shining under the glow of the streetlights. He leaned on the railing, the envelope still sitting on the table behind him, unopened a second time. For years, he had carried the belief that closure had to come from others, from forgiveness, from recognition, from some grand gesture. But now he knew better. Closure wasn't something you waited for. It was something you gave yourself. Walter thought about the boy David once was, the child who had clung to his hand, who had laughed when Walter pushed him on the swing set, who had cried when scraped knees needed tending. That boy had lived in his heart far longer than the man who had wounded him. And perhaps Walter thought that was enough. He turned back inside, picked up the envelope, and tucked it into the drawer of his nightstand. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but simply because he no longer needed it to define him. As he turned off the light and sat quietly in the dim glow of his apartment, Walter realized the unexpected gift of that letter. Not the apology itself, but the proof that he had already done the hardest thing a man can do. He had chosen dignity over resentment, peace over bitterness, and for the first time, he could finally say to himself, without hesitation, "I'm free." The letter from David remained in Walter's nightstand drawer, untouched after that first reading. Some nights, as he reached for a book or his glasses, his fingers brushed against the envelope. But he never felt the need to open it again. Damn. Its contents had already served their purpose, though not in the way his son may have intended. Forgiveness had always been a complicated idea for Walter. Raised in a small Tennessee church, he had been taught that forgiveness was a duty, that to forgive meant to reconcile, to restore what was broken. For years, he believed that. He thought forgiveness meant waiting for the other person to say, "I'm sorry," and then offering a kind of absolution. But now, at 79, Walter saw it differently. He realized forgiveness was less about the other person and more about himself. It wasn't about pretending the hurt never happened or rushing back into someone's arms. It was about letting go of the bitterness that threatened to consume him. Carrying that bitterness, he knew, would only poison his own heart. One evening, Walter sat on his balcony with a cup of coffee, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He thought about Margaret, about how she used to tell him, "Don't hold on to anger, Walt. It'll only eat you alive." Back then, he hadn't really understood. But now, with the years behind him, he finally did. He whispered into the night, as if speaking to her, "I forgive him, Margaret, not for his sake, but for mine." The words surprised him, not because they felt forced, but because they felt true. Saying them out loud lifted something heavy from his chest. For the first time since that night, he overheard his son's cruel whisper. Walter felt no sharp sting, no twisting ache. What remained was sadness. Yes, but also peace. The next day, Emily stopped by again. She noticed the calm in her father's face as they shared a simple dinner of soup and bread. "You seem lighter tonight, Dad," she said gently. Walter smiled, lines deepening at the corners of his eyes. "I've been thinking. Forgiveness isn't about waiting for David to fix things. It's about me choosing not to carry his words any longer." Emily's eyes softened. "That's brave, Dad." "It's necessary," Walter replied. "I can't let a single moment, a single sentence, define the rest of my life." They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't the heavy silence Walter once knew. This was comfortable, almost healing. Later that evening, after Emily left, Walter sat alone, reflecting on what he had just said. He realized that forgiveness didn't mean he had to invite David back into his life right now. It didn't mean family dinners would resume, or that wounds would suddenly vanish. It simply meant that Walter had released himself from the chains of resentment. That night, as he prepared for bed, Walter opened the nightstand drawer one last time, took out the envelope, held it in his hands, and then slipped it into a box. Of old photographs, it belonged with the past, not with his present. Walter turned out the light, a gentle smile lingering on his face. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't weakness.
Ow.
It wasn't surrender. It was strength, the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who had finally chosen peace over pain. And as he drifted to sleep, Walter knew that whatever the future held with David, he was no longer bound to the hurt. He had freed himself. Months passed, and Walter Harris's life began to settle into a rhythm he never imagined he would know. His mornings started with coffee on the balcony, watching the sun climb over the rooftops. His afternoons were filled with simple pleasures, watering the plants, strolling to the park, or reading books he had once been too busy to open. In the evenings, he often sat quietly, letting the hum of the city below remind him that life was still moving forward. So was he. The pain of David's words had not disappeared, but it no longer defined him. What once echoed like a wound was now just a memory, filed away like an old photograph. Walter had learned to live without the constant ache of needing his son's approval. Instead, he found meaning in the small things: sunlight on his face, the laughter of children playing in the distance, the knowledge that he could still choose joy. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves swirled through the air, Walter walked through the park and paused at a bench. He watched couples pass by, families sharing picnics, and grandparents pushing strollers. For the first time in a long while, he felt no envy, no bitterness. He felt content. Life wasn't perfect, but it was his. Later that night, Emily called. She asked how he was doing, and Walter's answer came easily. "I'm good, sweetheart. It's better than I've been in years." And for once, he meant every word. After hanging up, he sat by the window with a pen and notebook in hand. He began to write, not to David, not to Emily, but to himself. He wrote about the years of sacrifice, about the heartbreak of rejection, about the strength it took to finally walk away, and at the end, he wrote one sentence that seemed to capture it all. "Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to let go and live for yourself." Walter closed the notebook and felt a calm he had never known before. His journey had not been about anger or revenge. It had been about reclaiming his dignity, about discovering that peace is found not in someone else's apology, but in choosing your own freedom. And as he turned off the light that night, Walter smiled, knowing he had stepped into the final, most important chapter of his life, one where he was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by the peace he had found. Life lesson for you. Walter's story reminds us that letting go is not weakness, it is courage. It is the act of choosing peace over pain, dignity over resentment, freedom over the weight of someone else's rejection. So if you've been holding on to something or someone that only brings you hurt, maybe it's time to take Walter's lesson to heart. Choose yourself. Choose peace. Because life is too short to live chained to words that don't honor who you truly are. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, heal, and remind us that it's never too late to start again.